Hi, hello. Welcome to your Unit 1 set of videos. Please make sure that you know exactly what homework format you need to use, and go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so for our topic today, we are looking at the Zhou Dynasty. We've already looked at the Xia, we've looked at the Shang, so now we're going to go ahead and look at the Zhou Dynasty. So what are we going to get out of this? Number one, hey, when should world history start? Number two, which sources or information is the most beneficial for historians to understand a civilization? And then lastly, number three, what did the Zhou dynasty focus on? So let's go ahead and get started. So before the Zhou dynasty, there's very little information that shows us, historians, about their ideas of law, justice, and administrative offices. So in other words, during the Xia and the Shang dynasty, we don't really know how they actually facilitated their laws, directions, etc. But when the Zhou dynasty came in, they had a pretty incredible political authority all in northern China. They were particularly in the northwestern part of China. The Zhou were very tough peoples who battled the Shang forces in the east and the nomadic raiders from the west. So they were pretty militaristic. The Zhou allied with the Shang and they won recognition as kings of the western regions. And because they organized their allies more effectively than the Shang, they gradually just started to dominate and they ultimately displaced the Shang dynasty and ruled. All right, so the rise of the Shang. So the Shang and the Zhou ambitions started to collide in the late 12th century BCE. And according to Zhou accounts, because once again, we mainly only have Zhou dynasty information as opposed to the Shang dynasty information, the last Shang king was a criminal fool who gave himself over to wine, women, tyranny, and greed. And I want you to think about, well, why would the Zhou dynasty paint the last king like this? What's the point of doing that? But as a result of this, many of the towns and political districts started to distrust the Shang dynasty and transfer their loyalties to the Zhou. After several unsuccessful attempts to displace the Shang king, Zhou forces seized the Shang capital of Yin, beheaded the king, and replaced his administration with their own administration in 1122 BCE. The new rulers allowed the Shang heirs actually to still continue to govern smaller districts within the now newly founded Zhou dynasty. So it wasn't as if they killed all of the Shang authority figures or representatives. They definitely still kept them going, but they just killed the one central figure, right, the king. And so then now you have a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, that ruled most of northern and central China until 256 BCE. And that's a pretty large chunk of time, right? From 1122 to 256 BCE. The Zhou state was much larger than the Shang. It was so extensive that a single central court could not rule the entire land effectively, at least not with the transportation and communication technologies that were available at that time. So to try to alleviate that situation, the Zhou rulers relied on a decentralized administration, which means they essentially they gave their power, authority, responsibility to their various subordinates who would in turn they would give their allegiance, they would give them tributes being like money, and military support to the central government. And as long as those subordinates would do that, they would essentially be like governors of that specific piece of land. So during the early days of the dynasty, that system worked very, very well. The Zhou dynasty ruled their ancestral homeland from their capital of Hao, I believe, near modern-day Yan, but they allotted possessions and conquered territories to their relatives and other allies. So once again, I want you to think, well, why would the Zhou rulers start giving off pieces of land to their relatives and just other allies? What kind of benefit would they have from that? And just to give you some context, here is a map of now the Shang dynasty inside of the Zhou dynasty. So now the Zhou dynasty is everything in this purpley and bluey color. So it's a lot more massive than the Shang dynasty. So they needed a lot more people and resources to help them out, hence the decentralized administration. So these subordinates, they ruled their territories with pretty limited supervision from the central government because they so heavily relied on this type of administration. In return for not like having a bunch of Zhou dynasty policemen, if you want to think of it like that, they would have to visit the Zhou royal court on very special occasions to demonstrate their continued loyalty to the dynasty. They would have to deliver taxes and, once again, tribute. And they provided military forces that the kings deployed in the interests of the Zhou state as a whole. If they were not already related to the subordinates, the Zhou rulers would try to create arranged marriages that would once again strengthen their political ties. So they tried their best to make sure that all of their power was kept within one central area. It's pretty smart. But obviously they do not exist anymore. So we're going to see how they slowly started to have their power be weakened. So despite their best efforts, the Zhou kings could not maintain control indefinitely over their decentralized political system. Subordinates gradually established their own basis of power. So they ruled their territories not only as allies of the Zhou kings, but also as a long-established and traditional governors. They set up regional bureaucracies, armies, and tax systems, which allowed them to consolidate their rule, to exercise their authority, and to have their own money. So they didn't have to give all their money to the Zhou capital. They started to create their own law codes and enforce them with their own militaries. And as they became more secure in their rule, they started to become more independent from the Zhou dynasty themselves. And as they were becoming more and more independent, they would start ignoring their obligations to appear at royal courts or to deliver all of their tax proceeds to the capital, right? And occasionally they refused to provide military support or even turn their forces against the dynasty in an effort to build up their own regional states. So as a result, if you see this map over here, now instead of having everything be the Zhou dynasty, you're having all these little mini regional pieces of land or states, if you will, that is coming up. You can still see the Zhou dynasty like right smack dab in the middle-ish. It's pretty small compared to everything else. So before we continue forward, we need to look at the technological developments with iron, right? With iron works, metal works. And by looking at how iron quickly spread all throughout China, it really started to be in the favor of the subordinate rulers. Because the Zhou rulers were not able to control or have a monopoly over the metal production as closely as the Shang dynasty was. So just really quickly, a monopoly, right, is when one company or one source has all of the production for one product. Okay, so they are the only ones that you go to buy certain things, right? If you ever played the game Monopoly, that's what it's all about. So during the first millennium BCE, the technology of iron metallurgy spread to China and gradually made bronze weapons obsolete. So now instead of bronze, you have your ironworks coming in. And because iron ore was cheaper, more abundant, and widely distributed than copper and tin, the Zhou kings, they were unable to control who had access to them. Hence, they were unable to control this new weapon that could potentially eradicate them. Their subordinates moved quickly to establish ironworks and outfit their forces with iron weapons that were just as effective as they're employed by Zhou armies. And thus, iron weapons enabled subordinates to resist the central government and pursue their own interests. So going back to the weakening of the Zhou dynasty. So then in the early 8th century BCE, the Zhou rulers faced severe problems that brought the dynasty to the point of collapse. And this started around 771 BCE, where you have a group of nomadic peoples invading China from the west, most likely coming from Central Asia. So they came during the rule of a particularly ineffective king. And when subordinates refused to support the king, the invaders just overwhelmed the capital of the Zhou dynasty. Also, I want you to think back to when and how the Zhou dynasty came in and overthrew the Shang dynasty, right? There was an ineffective king. Same thing happened here. So following that disaster of the nomadic peoples, right, invading from the western part of China, the royal court decided to move east so that their capital wouldn't be targeted again. But by moving their capital, and I have it here on your map, this essentially ended the Zhou dynasty by moving that capital, because as they were moving it, it essentially brought so many territories the opportunity to invade, to take various objects, etc. By the 5th century BCE, territorial princes ignored the central government and used their resources to build, strengthen, and expand their states. They fought ferociously with one another in hopes of establishing themselves as leaders of a new political order. And this thus created the end of the Zhou dynasty and the start of a almost 200-year war, if you will. So during the last parts of the Zhou dynasty, it became so violent that it became known as the period of the warring states, where you have all of these states that I have here on your map essentially fighting each other for power, whatever. By 256 BCE, the Zhou dynasty ended when the last king abdicated his position, right? He just left his job under extreme pressure from his ambitious subordinate king in a neighboring land called the Qin States. Okay, and looking at this map right here, you can actually see the new capital of the Zhou dynasty, and yet there is no Zhou dynasty anymore, right? They are completely gone and eradicated. They would have been in this really tiny place, but now they're gone. So now you have this new Western state that's coming in and seeking that power, and they essentially won. The Qin dynasty was established in 221 BCE, and they essentially returned China back to an effective central government. And I really want you to think about, did the Zhou dynasty essentially create their own downfall, right? Based on this information I've given you here. And with that, that's the end of our notes for today. So what do we learn? Hey, humans are still complex. 2, in ancient China, one of the most important pieces of information comes from government records. So whenever I talk about China, I'm most likely going to be mentioning their government because that's where we get a lot of information from. And then lastly, the Zhou dynasty focused on their political rule, and they focused more so on how to divide up power to make sure that the power doesn't stand and sit with one person, so they wouldn't be super overwhelmed with the job, but also they could expand their rule everywhere else. If you have any questions, you know exactly what to do. Wow, what a fantastic, invigorating, insightful, productive, wonderful video that Miss I has created for you. Yes, I know, you can go ahead and clap for me. It's totally fine. Please, please, please make sure that you have completed whatever homework format I have asked and given to you for this video, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Goodbye.